Right now, the coastlines of the world feel obvious. The ocean stops where it stops. The beach begins where it begins. Harbours, cliffs, islands, bays. They all seem to belong exactly where they are, as if the map has finally settled into its true shape. I think about this sometimes when I stand near the sea. There is something persuasive about a shoreline, the sound of it, the repetition, the way the water returns to the same stones again and again until permanence starts to feel like a fact. But it isn't. The ocean's edge is only the latest version of a boundary that has moved before. Not in metaphor, not in myth. In actual miles of land gained and lost, in valleys drowned, in river mouths erased, in places where people may once have walked, cooked, buried their dead, watched the weather, and taught their children the names of things. Places that are now under water. 12,000 years ago, if you could have looked down at Earth from space, you would not have recognized it. The continents had different edges. The seas were pulled back. Islands were attached to mainlands. Straits were open plains. What we now call the North Sea was, in places, a lived-in landscape of rivers and marshes. Southeast Asia was joined into a vast tropical shelf. The Persian Gulf was not a gulf at all, but a low river valley, and over much of the northern world there was ice, not a winter coating, not mountain snow, ice sheets thick enough to bend the crust of the earth beneath them. Ice that had been gathering for tens of thousands of years, layer by layer, season by season, until it became a kind of frozen architecture built on a planetary scale. Above what is now Chicago, there was nothing like Chicago. No grid of streets, no lakefront, no lights, just glacial ice, possibly 2 miles thick, pressing downward with a weight almost impossible to imagine. North America was buried under the Laurentide ice sheet, Scandinavia and northern Europe under the Fennoscandian ice. Vast regions of Asia were locked in cold. In the southern hemisphere, the ice around Patagonia and Antarctica reached far beyond its modern limits. At the height of the last ice age, roughly a third of Earth's land surface was covered by ice. The planet was not dead. That is important. It was not empty or still or waiting for us to arrive. It was alive in a different arrangement. Cold grasslands stretched across enormous distances. Herds moved through them in numbers that would look unreal now. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, horses, bison, reindeer. Predators followed. People followed too. Small human groups, scattered thinly across a huge and difficult world, learning it with an intimacy most of us can barely imagine. They knew where animals crossed rivers. They knew which valleys held shelter from the wind. They knew where stone could be found, where fuel could be gathered, where certain plants returned in season. Their world was harsh, but it was legible. It had patterns. It could be learned. And then the patterns began to change, not all at once. No one woke one morning and saw the Ice Age end. Something shifted slowly, far beyond human sight, in Earth's orbit, in its tilt, in the long changing angle of sunlight over the northern summers. The ice began to lose more than it gained, at the edges first, then more deeply, a little more meltwater each season, a little more exposed ground, a little more dark earth and open water absorbing heat where reflective ice had been. Over the next several thousand years, the transformation became enormous. Sea levels rose by more than 400 feet. Entire continental shelves disappeared beneath the ocean. Lowlands that had supported animals and people for generations became tidal flats, then bays, then seafloor. Glacial lakes burst through ice dams and carved landscapes in days. Rivers changed course, coastlines retreated inland. Weather systems reorganized themselves. The familiar world, familiar to the people who lived inside it, came apart, and the giants began to vanish. Woolly mammoths, animals that had survived earlier ice ages, disappeared from most of the world. So did saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, dire wolves, mastodons, and dozens of other large animals that had shaped the ecosystems around them for millions of years. Their disappearance was not a single event with a single cause. Climate was changing, habitats were fragmenting, human hunting pressure was spreading, the old balances were failing. To us, looking backward, it is geology and extinction and climate transition. To the people living through it, it must have been stranger than that. A hunting ground that no longer held the same animals, a shoreline that had moved since childhood, a cold season that came differently, a valley that flooded and did not return, elders remembering places younger people would never see. Children growing up in a world that did not quite match the stories they inherited. There is a detail about the ice sheets that changes the scale of this period for me. Their weight was so vast that they physically pushed the land downward. The crust of the earth sank under them. Scandinavia was pressed down by hundreds of meters beneath the Fennoscandian ice sheet. The region around Hudson Bay was depressed so deeply that parts of it are still rising today, thousands of years after the ice disappeared. Parts of Scotland are still lifting. Parts of Finland gain height year by year. Geologists call this isostatic rebound. But the phrase feels almost too clean for what it describes. The land is remembering the ice with its body. That is the kind of world we're talking about. A world where even stone was not as fixed as it seemed. Where the weight of the past remained after the past itself had melted away. And this is why the end of the Ice Age matters so much. Temperature changed, yes, but temperature was only the beginning. The outline of the land changed. The routes between continents changed. The richest human habitats, coastlines, river mouths, shallow shelves, estuaries, shifted or disappeared. The places most likely to preserve the missing chapters of human life were often the very places the ocean took first. That problem still haunts prehistory. We have built much of our story from dry land because dry land is where excavation is easiest. But Ice Age people were not choosing their homes for the convenience of future archaeologists. They followed food, water, shelter, fish runs, shellfish beds, river mouths, seasonal abundance. Many of those places are now beneath the sea, covered by sediment, difficult to reach and barely explored. So when we ask what humans knew before agriculture, before cities, before writing, we're asking a question with part of the archive missing. Not destroyed, necessarily, drowned. Almost everything we think of as civilization, farming, permanent villages, cities, writing, organized religion, monumental building, emerged after this great transformation. Not in the frozen world at its height, but in the unstable, flooded, warming world that came after it. The melt did not simply end an ice age. It rearranged the conditions under which human beings could live, gather, remember, experiment, and build. Much of the world we recognize began there in the long confusion after the ice started to die. So we should begin before the water rose too far, before the shelves drowned, before the old coastlines disappeared, at the peak of the ice, when the frozen world still seemed permanent and no one living inside it had any reason to believe that the ground beneath their stories was already preparing to move. Picture this. You're standing where Chicago is today, but there is no Chicago. No Lake Michigan, no prairie, no farms, just a wall of ice so tall you cannot see its top, 2 miles of solid glacial ice stacked above you, pressing down with a weight that has bent the bedrock itself. The ground under your feet has sunk hundreds of feet under the load, and this ice has been here for longer than any human story can reach. That was the Laurentide ice sheet. It covered all of Canada and reached south across the northern United States, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, from the Arctic down to roughly where New York, Chicago and Seattle sit today. Just ice. Endless, crushing, miles thick ice. And that was only North America. Europe had the Fennoscandian ice sheet, blanketing Scandinavia, covering the Baltic Sea, reaching into northern Germany and Poland and east into Russia. Britain wasn't an island. It was the western edge of a frozen European landmass connected to the continent by hundreds of miles of exposed seafloor, a place we now call Doggerland. We'll come back to it, because its story is one of the more haunting of this whole period. Asia had its own ice complexes. The Tibetan plateau was buried. Siberia had glacial fields dwarfing anything that survives today. In the southern hemisphere, ice around Patagonia and Antarctica was vastly larger than it is now. All told, ice covered about 30% of the Earth's land surface during what geologists call the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, when the ice reached its greatest extent. Today, ice covers about 10% of land. That difference, that extra 20%, represents an almost incomprehensible volume of frozen water. Water that was not in the ocean. It had been pulled up by evaporation over tens of thousands of years, fallen as snow onto the growing ice sheets, and simply stayed there, compressed deeper and deeper into ice that never melted. The ocean was being slowly drained to feed the glaciers, which is why sea levels during the LGM were roughly 400 feet lower than today. 400 feet. That's the height of a 40-story building. And when sea levels drop that far, land appears. Vast territories that are now underwater were exposed, and they weren't empty. The Bering Strait didn't exist. In its place was Beringia, a subcontinent roughly the size of Texas, usually called a land bridge, but really much more than that. It was a landscape. It had its own weather, its own river systems, its own animal populations. Mammoths grazed there, horses ran across it, and humans crossed it, or lived on it for generations, as they made their way from Asia into the Americas. Off the coast of what is now Britain and northern Europe, Doggerland stretched across what is now the North Sea floor, a rolling plain of marshes, river valleys and forests, probably one of the most productive hunting landscapes in Ice Age Europe. People lived there, raised families there, left behind tools that North Sea fishermen still occasionally pull up in their nets today, from the seafloor 60 metres down. And then there was Sundaland, the continental shelf of Southeast Asia, the area between modern mainland Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines, was largely exposed during the LGM, a landmass the size of India. Connected, tropical, with rivers and forests and coastlines rich with resources year-round. Some researchers think Sundaland may have supported the densest human populations anywhere on Earth during the Ice Age. We can't know for certain. Nearly all the archaeological evidence is now sitting under 200 feet of seawater. That's a thought worth letting land for a moment. Entire regions where millions of people may have lived, entire landscapes of human memory, are gone. Not in catastrophe, but in slow inundation. We don't know what was there because we can't reach it. What we're missing, we can only guess at. The climate of the LGM wasn't just colder, it was structurally different. The jet streams were pushed far south by the ice sheets, creating climate zones with no modern equivalent. Tropical regions were smaller and drier. The Amazon rainforest was fragmented into isolated patches. The Sahara was more arid than it is today. Deserts expanded across Central Asia. But some regions that are marginal now were actually livable then. Certain areas of North Africa had reliable water sources. Parts of the Middle East that are dry today supported substantial vegetation. The climate wasn't uniformly worse, it was simply different. Radically different from anything in recorded history. And across this alien planet, one ecosystem dominated the northern latitudes. A vast grassland stretching from Spain across Europe and Asia all the way to Alaska and the Yukon, maintained by the peculiar conditions of glacial climate. Cold and dry, but with enough summer sun to support enormous herds. The biomass density of this mammoth steppe may have rivaled the modern African savanna. Herds of thousands of animals migrating across continental distances, a world of giants, woolly mammoths standing 11 feet at the shoulder, with curved tusks up to 16 feet long. Woolly rhinoceros browsing alongside them. In North America, mastodons in the forested regions south of the ice sheets. Giant ground sloths, some reaching 20 feet when standing upright. Glyptodonts, essentially armoured tanks the size of small cars. Short-faced bears, the largest terrestrial carnivores that ever lived, were 12 feet tall on their hind legs and fast. This was the world at its height. Frozen, yes. Harsh, certainly. But enormously, almost impossibly alive. And it was already beginning to end in ways no one could yet feel. Before we watch the ice begin to melt, we should spend some time with the people who are living inside this world, because the image the Ice Age tends to conjure, hunched figures in rough skins, cowering in cave mouths, barely getting through the winter, is not what the evidence shows. The total global human population during the last glacial maximum was somewhere between 1 and 10 million people. For comparison, that's roughly the current population of New York City, scattered across the entire planet. We were rare. We were scattered across enormous distances. But we were not struggling to think. The humans of the LGM wore tailored clothing, not just animal skins draped over their bodies, but carefully engineered garments. Parkas, pants, boots, mittens, sewn with bone needles using thread made from animal sinew. Archaeological sites in Siberia have turned up clothing fragments, and toolkits sophisticated enough that an Arctic expedition outfitter today would recognize the underlying logic. These people had solved the problem of cold. They had solved it well. Where natural caves weren't available, they built. The mammoth bone houses of Ukraine and Russia are among the most striking structures in all of human prehistory. Frameworks built from mammoth skulls, tusks and long bones, covered with hides, partially buried for insulation. Some were large enough to shelter extended families through months of brutal winter. They weren't improvised. They were engineered and rebuilt season after season. Their tools were specialized and constantly evolving. Spear points designed for different prey. Butchering implements optimized for different tasks. The atlatl, the spear thrower, had already been invented, effectively extending the human arm and letting hunters launch projectiles with enough force to penetrate mammoth hide from a safe distance. Purpose-built equipment, not whatever came to hand. But perhaps the most striking thing is what they maintained across distance. Groups separated by hundreds of miles stayed in contact, trading raw materials, sharing information about game movements and seasonal resources, exchanging members to maintain genetic diversity. Archaeologists can trace specific flint types hundreds of miles from their geological source, embedded in tools at sites far across the landscape. Identical tool styles appear across enormous geographic ranges. These weren't isolated bands, they were parts of something larger. Think for a moment about what that required. Two groups living 300 miles apart, no written language, no maps, no fixed infrastructure, maintaining a relationship reliable enough to exchange people and materials across generations. The knowledge of where the other group would be, and when, and what they might need, had to be held in memory and passed down orally, year after year, surviving the deaths of the individuals who carried it. A social technology for managing relationships across space and time. And it worked. The material trace of it is still readable in the archaeological record today, in the distribution of flint and obsidian and amber across hundreds of excavation sites. And then there's the art. Imagine standing in the Chauvet cave in southern France 32,000 years ago. The passage narrows, then opens into a vaulted chamber. Firelight moves across the walls, and there, painted with a confidence that doesn't look hesitant or primitive at all, are horses, rhinoceroses, lions, bears, dozens of them, painted with shading, with a sense of motion, with what looks like genuine attention to how these animals actually moved. The cave paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, most of them date to the LGM or just before. So do carved figurines, decorated tools, shell beads transported hundreds of miles from the coast. These weren't survival activities. They required time, thought, and something we might as well call an inner life. The idea that art and intellectual complexity arrived only after the ice melted, that's not what the caves suggest. The stories told around fires during the LGM would eventually become stories told in warmer times, and some of what was witnessed during the melt, the floods, the vanishing coastlines, the dying giants, may have lodged so deeply in human memory that faint echoes are still audible today. We'll come back to that. But for now, these people knew the world as a frozen place. The ice had been there for longer than any story reached. It was simply the nature of things, as permanent as mountains. They had no reason to think it would ever change. They were wrong. Around 18,000 years ago, something began to shift. Not on Earth exactly, but in Earth's relationship with the Sun. Something so slow and so vast that no living person at the time could have perceived it. A change in the geometry of the solar system itself. Our planet doesn't orbit the Sun in a perfect circle. It doesn't spin on a perfectly upright axis, and it doesn't hold that axis steady. It wobbles, tilts, and traces an orbital path that stretches and compresses over tens of thousands of years. 3 separate rhythms, playing at different speeds, occasionally aligning in ways that change how much solar energy reaches different parts of the Earth at different times of year. A Serbian mathematician named Milutin Milankovic spent decades in the early 20th century calculating these cycles by hand. His conclusion, that tiny variations in Earth's orbital geometry could trigger ice ages, was dismissed for years as too subtle to matter. He was right. Evidence from ice cores, ocean sediment, and cave formations around the world has since confirmed it. The ice ages run on a schedule written in the sky. Around 18,000 years ago, these 3 rhythms converged. The slow wobble of Earth's axis was shifting to deliver stronger summer sunlight to the northern hemisphere, where most of the planet's landmass sits and where most of the ice was. The tilt of the axis was increasing, making summers hotter and winters colder, and the orbit itself was becoming more elliptical, amplifying seasonal extremes a little further. None of these changes was large on its own, but they were all pointing in the same direction at the same time, and their combined effect was enough to tip the first domino. The warming that followed was, at first, almost imperceptible, a fraction of a degree per century. The world seemed exactly as it had always been, but at the margins of the great ice sheets, not the thick ancient centres, but the lower, southernmost edges, summer melting began to increase, slightly, then a little more, and then the ice's own reflectivity became the problem. White ice sends most of the sun's energy back into space, sometimes up to 90%. Dark soil and dark rock absorb that same energy as heat. Every square mile of ice that melted exposed ground that warmed instead of reflecting. That warmth melted more ice, which exposed more ground. The process compounded itself in a direction the ice had no way to resist. The same dynamic was playing out at sea. Ice-covered ocean reflects sunlight. Open water absorbs it. As sea ice retreated in the Arctic, dark surface water absorbed more solar energy, warming the ocean, preventing the ice from reforming as extensively the following winter. The Arctic was shifting from mirror to sponge. Then the atmosphere joined in. As ice sheets retreated, they exposed soil and vegetation that had been sealed under glaciers for millennia. That material began decomposing, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. The warming oceans, cold water holds more dissolved CO2 than warm water, began outgassing their own stored carbon. Ice core records from Antarctica show the signal clearly. Around 18,000 years ago, atmospheric CO2 began climbing. From roughly 180 parts per million at the glacial maximum, it would eventually reach 280 by the time the warming was complete. 100 extra parts per million, trapping heat, warming the ocean, releasing more carbon. Each step making the next one more likely. The ocean circulation was changing too. The great conveyor belt of currents, warm surface water flowing north, cooling and sinking near Greenland, returning south along the ocean floor, had been sluggish during the LGM, slowed by cold freshwater melt diluting the North Atlantic. As warming continued, this circulation strengthened again. Warm tropical water started flowing north more vigorously, carrying heat to high latitudes, melting ice from below even as the sun melted it from above. The ice had nowhere to go. What had begun as a slight shift in orbital geometry had set off a chain of reinforcing processes, each one adding heat, each one making it harder for the cold to return. The Laurentide sheet over North America, the Fennoscandian sheet over Europe, structures built over 100,000 years, containing enough frozen water to raise sea levels by 400 feet, were not going to collapse quickly, but they were retreating. Year by year, century by century, the margins pulling back. Meltwater poured off in volumes difficult to imagine. Rivers the size of the Amazon flowing only in summer, carrying the remnants of the Ice Age into a warming ocean. And the people living at the edges of these retreating sheets, the hunters, the artists, the people who had built their knowledge of the world around its frozen rhythms, were beginning to notice something. Summers that lasted a little longer, winters that bit a little less. Ground that had been permafrost within living memory now soft enough to work with. They couldn't know what was coming. They couldn't know the process was irreversible. That the world they had adapted to so carefully over so many generations was already being unmade beneath their feet. The melting had begun, and it was about to become something far larger than a gradual warming. It was about to become a flood. Around 14,600 years ago, the sea began to rise, not like a tide, not with the old promise of return, This water came in and stayed for centuries. Geologists call it Meltwater Pulse 1A. In their compressed language, that means a period of roughly 300 to 500 years during which global sea levels rose somewhere between 50 and 80 feet. In human terms, it means the continental shelves of the world, those shallow platforms extending for miles from many coastlines before the seafloor drops away, began to vanish, not abstractly, visibly, within the span of lives people could remember. Coastlines that communities had known for generations, had named, navigated, and built their seasonal lives around, were consumed by the advancing water. One fishing camp at a time, one hunting ground, one burial place, one familiar curve of shore. Flat coastlines make sea level rise cruelly efficient. A shoreline does not always fall away steeply like a riverbank. Often it slopes so gently that a single foot of vertical rise can push the water dozens of yards inland. Multiply that by 80 feet over 3 centuries, and the numbers stop behaving like numbers. Grandparents could remember beaches, tidal pools, sandbars, islands on the horizon, places their grandchildren would know only as stories. Once you think of it this way, a shoreline stops feeling like a line on a map. It becomes a slow-moving event. Where did the water come from? Part of it came from Antarctica. Ocean floor cores taken around the continent contain massive deposits of glacial debris, material once locked inside moving ice, carried outward as the ice advanced, then released when enormous sections of the Antarctic ice sheet destabilized and broke apart into the Southern Ocean. Structures of ice the size of countries were losing coherence. The water they had stored for thousands of years had nowhere to go except up. North America had its own instabilities. As the Laurentide ice sheet retreated, it left behind depressions that filled with meltwater, glacial lakes of extraordinary size, held back not by bedrock but by ice itself. The ice acted as a dam along their margins. As it thinned, those dams weakened. And when an ice dam fails, it rarely fails politely. Picture a glacier holding back a lake the size of a small sea for 2,000 years. A crack develops. It widens slowly, then less slowly. Decades become years, years become months. Then, in a matter of days, the stored water finds the gap. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington are what that kind of release looks like when it's written into stone. Bare basalt carved into enormous channels, ripple marks in the bedrock taller than a house. Boulders, the mass of small buildings dropped hundreds of miles from where they began. A flood violent enough to strip the land down to its skeleton. The record is still there if you know how to read it, and it did not happen only once. Glacial lakes found their outlets at different times, each ice dam failing in its own season, each release sending cold, fresh water into the ocean. Together these events were doing more than cutting new channels through land. They were disturbing the engine that moves heat around the northern hemisphere. The North Atlantic's great conveyor of currents, warm tropical water flowing north, releasing heat over Europe, cooling, sinking, and returning south along the ocean floor, depends on a simple physical fact. Salty water is denser than fresh water. When warm, salty water reaches the cold latitudes near Greenland. It cools enough to sink, pulling more warm water in behind it. That sinking is the engine. Weaken it, and northwestern Europe begins to lose the heating system that makes its climate far milder than its latitude should allow. The fresh water pouring off the ice sheets was diluting the North Atlantic surface. Not enough yet to stop the circulation, enough to make it falter. With each pulse of meltwater, the system ran a little less smoothly as if something deep in the planet's plumbing had begun to cough. This is where the flood becomes more than climate mechanics. Ice Age settlement was not evenly distributed across the continents. Much of the interior remained ice, tundra, desert, or harsh, glacial terrain. The coasts, with shellfish beds, fish runs, estuaries, and access to both marine and terrestrial food, were often where life was most generous. And Meltwater Pulse 1A was eating the coasts. Thousands of miles of inhabited shoreline were being claimed, yard by water that did not care what people remembered. Local knowledge built over generations, seasonal rhythms, safe crossings, burial sites, hunting grounds, sacred places, lost its anchor. Displaced communities did not move inland into emptiness. They moved into territories already known and used by others. Rising seas compressed people into smaller spaces, creating contact, exchange, pressure, and conflict between groups that geography had once kept apart. In the stories those communities carried with them, the places now underwater, the beaches no one could reach, the old world remembered by elders, something began to settle into human memory. For centuries, freshwater had been weakening the North Atlantic heat pump. By around 12,900 years ago, that weakening reached a threshold. What came next was not a cooling trend. It was a climate falling through a trapdoor, across an astonishing number of cultures, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from ancient India to Pacific Island navigators, from Aboriginal Australian communities to indigenous nations of North America, from ancient China to sub-Saharan Africa. There are stories of waters rising beyond all precedent, a world remade by flood, a homeland gone beneath the sea, something irreplaceable lost where no one could reach it again. For a long time, the safer scholarly explanation was convergence. Water floods things. Floods frighten people. A catastrophic local flood can leave enough psychological force to become myth. So, the argument went, cultures around the world arrived at similar stories independently, each for its own local reasons. The pattern reflected universal human fear, not shared memory. That explanation still has value, but it no longer feels sufficient on its own. The version most familiar in the Western tradition comes from Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest sustained written narratives we have, preserved on clay tablets in Sumerian and Akkadian, contains a detailed account of a great deluge, divine warning, a vessel, animals taken aboard, the world submerged and slowly restored. The parallels to the later biblical account of Noah were close enough to shock 19th century scholars when the tablets were translated. A flood story older than the Bible had been sitting in clay, waiting. But writing was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story hardened into a form we could still read. Before the tablets, there were voices, retellings, generations of oral tradition moving through Mesopotamia before anyone pressed the words into wet clay. What survives is the fossilized surface of something older. How much older, no one can say. But the question lingers. When a story is already ancient at the moment it first becomes text, how far back does its memory go? The Hindu tradition offers a parallel. In early Sanskrit literature, Manu is warned by a divine fish of a coming catastrophic flood. He builds a vessel. The fish, eventually revealed as Vishnu, tows it to safety as the waters rise over the world. The resemblance to the Mesopotamian tradition is hard to miss. More interesting is where both stories place the flood, at the boundary between ages. Not simply disaster, but threshold. A before and an after. The Pacific Island traditions are harder to wave away as coincidence, because many of them are not vague. They name particular islands, landmarks, routes, coastal features, details precise enough that researchers have sometimes compared them with now submerged features of the Indo-Pacific shelves. These do not always feel like abstract stories about water. Some read like descriptions given by people who had been there, or by descendants of people who had. The coastlines no longer exist above water. The descriptions kept travelling anyway. The Aboriginal Australian material may be the most compelling of all. Indigenous communities around the Australian coast preserve oral accounts of times when the sea was lower, when bays now filled with water were dry land, when islands were hilltops on a coastal plain, when rivers ran farther out toward a more distant shore. In a number of documented cases, those stories correspond with the actual underwater topography of the continental shelf. The old bays are the right shape. The submerged hills are in the right places. Calling these accounts myth can make them sound less serious than they are. They are stories, yes, but stories can also be storage. Geography held in memory, warnings held in ritual. A cultural way of keeping a map after the land itself has gone underwater. If some of these memories really do reach back across hundreds of generations, then we have been underestimating what human cultures can preserve when a memory matters enough. This is where Graham Hancock becomes useful, not as someone we have to accept wholesale, but as someone asking a question that is harder to dismiss than many people want it to be. Hancock has argued most extensively in Magicians of the Gods that ancient flood myths may preserve memories of a real historical process, the end of the Ice Age, the drowning of coastal worlds, and the loss of landscapes where people had lived for thousands of years. His central observation is simple, and it is important. If many of the richest Ice Age habitats were coastal, and if those coasts are now underwater, then the archaeology of human prehistory has often been forced to search in the places that were left behind, not necessarily the places that mattered most. The usual objection is also important. We do not have direct archaeological evidence for the kind of sophisticated coastal cultures Hancock sometimes imagines. That constraint should not be brushed aside, but the absence has a geography. The places most likely to hold that evidence are now under 100 to 200 feet of water, covered by marine sediment and only lightly explored. We have found Ice Age human material on continental shelves, tools, hearths, structural traces, off British Columbia, in the North Sea, in parts of the Mediterranean. When we look with the right tools, the seafloor begins to answer. We just have not asked very much of it yet. Hancock may be wrong about many particulars. He does not need to be right about every reconstruction for the underlying problem to remain. If Ice Age people lived richly along coasts, and those coasts are now beneath the sea, then a dry land history of human origins is almost certainly incomplete. That is not a fringe idea. It follows from the water level. One flood story deserves its own pause because it has a geological mechanism that has been investigated in detail. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, proposed by oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, begins with this. Around 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean by a narrow barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, and sitting well below global sea level. Agricultural communities had settled around its shores, people growing crops, keeping animals, and living in what seems to have been a productive, stable landscape. Then the rising Mediterranean breached the barrier. Ryan and Pittman calculated that seawater may have poured through fast enough to raise the Black Sea by several inches a day in the early phase. Within a year, the lake level may have risen by more than 200 feet. Communities that had built houses, fields, paths, and graves along that shore could have watched the world they knew disappear within the memory of a single lifetime. Whether this event lies behind the Mesopotamian flood narratives, as Ryan and Pittman suggested, is harder to prove. The timelines and cultural links are not simple, but the Black Sea flood itself belongs in the record of real human displacement. A populated landscape was inundated, people left, and wherever they went they carried the memory of water crossing a boundary it had never crossed before. What these accounts share may not be one single flood. It may be a recurring human discovery, that the ground beneath your feet is less permanent than it feels, that the line between land and water can move, that the ocean is patient and patient things can still be catastrophic. Knowledge like that does not disappear easily. It becomes story because story is one of the ways human beings keep danger alive after the danger has passed. Just when the world seemed to be stabilizing, ice retreating, coastlines adjusting, people pressing into newly habitable landscapes, the climate reversed. Not gradually, not in a way anyone could have adapted to season by season. It reversed the way a door slams, abruptly, completely, with a force the geological record still registers as something close to instantaneous. 12,900 years ago, temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by approximately 15 degrees Celsius. Greenland ice cores, with their annual layers of snowfall, show the transition as a sharp boundary between two climate regimes. It may have taken less than a decade to establish. Some interpretations suggest only a few years. Ice sheets that had been retreating for 7,000 years stopped, then advanced. Young forests at the ice margins died back. Tundra returned. Arctic wildflowers reappeared in regions that had only recently begun to soften. Scientists named this period the Younger Dryas, after one of those flowers, Dryas octopetala, a small white-petaled plant adapted to cold, dry, open ground. Its fossil pollen, appearing again in sediment cores across northern Europe, became one of the clearest biological signatures of the event, a delicate name for 1,200 years of cold. The leading explanation begins in the interior of North America. Lake Agassiz, a vast glacial lake formed in the depression left by the retreating Laurentide ice sheet, had grown larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. For a long time it drained slowly southward. But as the ice retreated, new routes opened. At some point the lake may have found a path east through the young Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence corridor, or north into the Arctic. Either route sent an enormous pulse of cold, fresh water toward the North Atlantic. The physics are simple, the scale is not. The North Atlantic heat pump depends on salty water becoming dense enough to sink when it cools. Freshwater diluted surface water resists sinking, even when cold. A large pulse from Lake Agassiz could have weakened the deep water formation that drives the circulation. Europe's heating system faltered. The consequences arrived in years, not centuries. That is the leading hypothesis. There is another one, more dramatic, more disputed, and to me too strange to flatten into a quick dismissal. In the sediment layer dating to roughly 12,900 years ago, researchers associated with what became known as the Comet Research Group identified a suite of unusual materials: nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, elevated platinum and iridium, and layers of charcoal and soot found across widely separated sites. Taken together, they argued, these markers could point to a cosmic event, a fragmented comet or asteroid, perhaps striking or exploding over the Laurentide ice sheet. In that scenario, the energy released would have vaporized or destabilized large amounts of ice, helped generate a freshwater pulse, ignited extensive fires, and thrown debris into the atmosphere. Climate shock, megafire, meltwater, darkness. It is a dramatic picture, and it is not the consensus explanation. But the reason it has persisted is that the boundary layer itself remains odd. Other researchers have challenged the interpretation. Some of the materials may be produced by non-impact processes. Some early methods and statistical claims have been criticized. The literature has not settled into a single clean answer. Still, the question refuses to disappear. The evidence at that boundary is unusual enough to keep the door open, even if it does not force us through it. Dismissing the whole problem too confidently can sound, oddly, as unscientific as accepting it too quickly. Hancock has spent a great deal of time with this evidence. His reading goes further than most professional scientists would follow. But again, the question underneath it matters. If an impact or airburst of that scale did occur, it would not have been only a climate event. It would have been a human catastrophe. Fire, flood, sudden cold, collapsing resources, and coastal communities already under pressure from rising seas. Cultures caught in that zone would not leave a neat archive behind. The fire, ice, and water would be very good at erasing one. His broader claim, that more sophisticated human societies may have existed before the Younger Dryas than the current record shows, remains unproven. But unproven and impossible are not the same word. Thin evidence and no evidence are different things, especially when much of the most relevant terrain is underwater, buried in sediment or barely surveyed. My own instinct is not that we should fill the gaps with fantasy. It is that we should stop pretending the gaps are small. The Younger Dryas was geographically uneven, and that unevenness matters. The North Atlantic region plunged back toward glacial conditions. New Zealand may have warmed slightly. Parts of South America saw less disruption. Antarctica barely registered the event. That pattern points to a Northern Hemisphere disruption, consistent with the failure of the North Atlantic heat pump, whatever triggered it. For human populations, the Younger Dryas was a filter, brutal but not absolute. Some communities in the Middle East, pressed by drought and the collapse of wild plant resources, intensified their experiments with deliberate cultivation. Crisis pushed them towards strategies they might have reached more slowly. Some traditions vanished. Others adapted and carried their knowledge through 12 centuries of cold. Then, 11,700 years ago, the circulation restarted. The ice cores record the shift with the same abruptness as the onset, temperatures rising by about 10 degrees Celsius in a decade or less. The Younger Dryas ended. The Holocene, our current geological epoch, began. The remaining ice sheets resumed their retreat, leaving behind a world that was scarred, transformed, and ready in ways no one could have planned. One answer to what that readiness meant is still being excavated from a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, about 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, there is a site that has been quietly disturbing the old story of human prehistory since Klaus Schmidt began excavating it in the 1990s. It sits on a ridge. That matters. 12,000 years ago, the view from that ridge would have opened over a green and productive landscape at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. Not desert. Not the dry, exposed hill country many people imagine now. A world of wild cereals, pistachio and almond trees, gazelle herds, seasonal grasses, springs, limestone plateaus and open sky. The site is not large by modern standards, but what is there should not, according to the older model, be there at all. Göbekli Tepe, the name means roughly Potbelly Hill in Turkish, is a complex of massive stone enclosures arranged in rough circles, built from T-shaped limestone pillars that in some cases stand more than 5 meters tall and weigh up to 10 tons each. The pillars are carved with assured, detailed bas-relief figures: foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, snakes, aurochs, and abstract symbols that recur across multiple enclosures in ways that suggest a shared symbolic vocabulary. The work does not look hesitant. It does not look like people guessing their way into monument building for the first time. It looks like the work of people operating inside a tradition. The site was built roughly 11,500 to 12,000 years ago, during and immediately after the Younger Dryas, before agriculture was fully established, before pottery, before metallurgy, before writing, before cities, before the familiar markers archaeologists once used to define the beginning of complex society. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by the available evidence, hunter-gatherers, mobile foraging communities without domesticated crops or herds in the conventional sense. And yet they quarried limestone, carved it, transported it, raised it, decorated it, and returned to the site again and again across generations. That is the problem Göbekli Tepe creates. Not that hunter-gatherers were intelligent. We already knew that, or should have. The Ice Age record had been telling us for a long time. Tailored clothing, long-distance exchange networks, cave art of extraordinary sophistication, memory systems capable of holding landscapes and relationships across hundreds of miles. The problem is more specific. Göbekli Tepe shows people organizing labor, meaning, ritual, landscape and time on a scale that the old sequence did not expect from foragers. It was supposed to go in the other direction. First farming, then surplus, then permanent villages, then hierarchy, then monuments, then temples. Here, the temple appears before the village in the old sense, or at least before the kind of village we were taught to expect. The excavations continued for 2 decades before Schmidt's death in 2014, and the work has carried on since. What has emerged is not a single monument, but a layered sequence, older enclosures buried beneath later ones, suggesting that the site was built, used, deliberately backfilled, and rebuilt across perhaps 1,000 years or more. The backfilling is one of the strangest details. At some point, each enclosure was carefully filled in with selected material and sealed. Then a new structure was built nearby or above. This was not simple abandonment. It does not look like people walking away from ruins. It looks like closure, as if the ending of an enclosure mattered almost as much as its construction. Why was it built? We do not know. Schmidt's working hypothesis was that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a ceremonial centre, perhaps a pilgrimage site serving communities spread across a wide region, a place where groups gathered periodically around shared ritual. The carved animals may have carried cosmological meanings. The symbols may encode stories we cannot read anymore. The scale of the pillars, the effort required to raise them, the care taken in their decoration, all of it suggests that the site was meant to do something to the people standing inside it. Or, perhaps, orientation, fear, belonging, a sense that the human world was being placed inside a larger order of animals, death, sky, season, and stone. There is something moving about imagining those gatherings. People arriving from different parts of the landscape after weeks of movement, bringing food, stories, tools, memory, news of animals and weather, perhaps grief, perhaps promises, fires burning on the ridge, the pillars standing in the dark like figures that were not quite human and not quite something else, the carved animals catching torchlight, the sky overhead, colder and sharper than ours, full of stars with no electric glow to weaken them. Whatever happened there, it was not casual. Göbekli Tepe was not a shelter. It was not a place you built because rain was coming. It was a place you built because something invisible had become socially necessary. That alone changes the story. What Göbekli Tepe tells us with certainty, regardless of how we interpret its purpose, is that the cognitive and organizational capacity for large-scale cooperative construction existed before the developments we once assumed were required for it. The surplus food that was supposed to free people from daily subsistence, the settled hierarchy that was supposed to direct the labour, the administrative machinery that was supposed to coordinate large projects. None of those appear in the expected form, and yet the monument exists. So either our model of how complexity develops was significantly wrong, or the people who built Göbekli Tepe were operating within social frameworks more sophisticated than we allowed mobile foragers to have. Those are not comfortable options, but the stones are still there. This is where Graham Hancock's interpretation becomes interesting, not because every claim has to be accepted, but because the question he asks is not easy to dismiss. Hancock has argued that Göbekli Tepe may represent not the beginning of a tradition, but the continuation of one. The construction skill, the symbolic vocabulary, the astronomical and ritual possibilities, the sheer confidence of the site. All of it may point to a lineage of knowledge older than the monument itself. In his reading, the people who built Göbekli Tepe may have carried forward practices, memories or cosmological frameworks from before the Younger Dryas disrupted the world. That is a large claim. The direct evidence for such a predecessor tradition has not been found. But again, we have to be careful with that sentence. Not found where? Not found on the dry land we have excavated. Not found in the sites that survived above modern sea level. Not found in the small fraction of the late Ice Age world that had been accessible to traditional archaeology. That is not the same as proving it was never there. And this is the point where Göbekli Tepe stops being only a local mystery and becomes part of the larger problem of the missing archive. Because Göbekli Tepe survived partly because of where it was, on a ridge, high enough to remain dry, high enough not to be erased by the rising sea, high enough that, after thousands of years, archaeologists could still put tools into the ground and find the pillars waiting. But if other communities had equally complex ritual landscapes along rivers, lagoons, estuaries or coastal plains, the very places where food, movement and gathering would have been easiest, many of those places would not be waiting under a hill. They would be under the water. That does not mean there are other Göbekli Tepes sitting intact on every continental shelf. It does not mean we get to fill the seafloor with whatever lost world we want to imagine. But it changes the weight of the question. Göbekli Tepe proves that late Ice Age and early Holocene foragers were capable of more than the old model allowed. It proves that monumentality, ritual coordination, symbolic systems, and large cooperative projects did not have to wait for cities. It proves that something we would once have placed after agriculture was already present at the edge of agriculture's beginning. So when we ask whether older or parallel traditions might have existed elsewhere, especially in now submerged coastal landscapes, we are not asking from fantasy alone. We're asking because one impossible-looking site has already been found on dry land, and dry land is only part of the former human world. There is another detail worth holding before we leave the ridge. The wild ancestor of domestic wheat, einkorn wheat, the grain from which later wheat cultivation descends, traces its genetic origin to this region of southeastern Turkey, to these hills, to the landscape the builders of Göbekli Tepe looked out over. The communities gathering here would have needed to eat. And on the slopes below grew wild grain in stands dense enough to harvest in quantity. Season after season, people coming to the site may have collected those cereals, carried them, processed them, stored them, spilled them, favoured certain plants without meaning to, returned to the same patches, and slowly changed their relationship with the grass around them. Agriculture may not have begun as a plan. It may have begun as a side effect of gathering, of ritual, of return, of people coming back to a meaningful place often enough that the plants around that place began to change with them. This is one of the most haunting possibilities Göbekli Tepe leaves us with, that the sacred may have come first, that people did not build temples because farming had already made them settled and comfortable. They may have moved towards settlement because gathering for ritual, memory and shared meaning made staying near certain places more important than it had been before. The monument did not simply reflect a changing world. It may have helped create one, and yet, even here, the site feels less like a beginning than a visible point in a longer, mostly hidden line. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not emerge from nowhere. They inherited ways of carving, ways of gathering, ways of reading animals, seasons, stone, sky, and one another. They inherited stories we cannot hear. They inherited losses we cannot measure. They lived after the melt had begun, after coastlines had moved, after older landscapes had already disappeared or were disappearing still. What survived on this ridge may be only the part of the story lucky enough to remain above water. That is why Göbekli Tepe matters so much here. It is not proof of a lost civilization. It is not an answer. It is a warning about our assumptions. If something this old, this strange, and this organized could sit under a hill in southeastern Turkey until the late 20th century, then the dry land record is not a complete inventory of what humans were capable of. It is a weathered remainder, a partial archive, a set of survivals shaped by geology as much as by culture. And once we understand that, the map begins to darken at the edges. Because beyond the ridges and hills and inland plains we can excavate, there were other worlds, low worlds, coastal worlds, river mouths, marshlands, forests, hunting grounds, islands, and estuaries that existed when the sea was lower and vanished when it rose. If Göbekli Tepe is what remained on the high ground, then the next question is unavoidable. What did the water take? The North Sea is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Container ships pass through it every day, and every so often, not often, but often enough that it no longer feels impossible, a fishing trawler pulls up its nets and finds something that should not be there. A hand axe, a carved antler, a piece of worked bone, objects made by human hands, brought up from the seafloor with the catch, from land that is now under 100 feet of water. Those objects are fragments of Doggerland, and Doggerland may be the most haunting lost landscape in European prehistory. During the last glacial maximum, the North Sea did not exist in the form we know. Much of the basin was dry, a broad, low plain stretching from eastern England toward the Netherlands, Denmark, and the coast of Norway. Rivers crossed it, forests grew in sheltered valleys, marshes formed where the drainage slowed. By every reconstruction, it was a rich edge landscape. Game, fish, birds, reeds, wood, water. The kind of place where people could live well without travelling far. Archaeologist Brian E. Coles gave it the name Doggerland in the 1990s, and since then the picture has slowly filled in. Seasonal camps, fishing places, tools, animal bones, possibly burial grounds. people built their relationship to the natural world around a place that has almost entirely disappeared from sight. Some researchers now think Doggerland may have supported denser populations than the forested regions to the south and east that survived above water. The drowning began gradually. As sea levels rose through the early post-glacial period, the southern edges of the plain slipped under first, narrowing the land from below. Communities moved back from one shoreline, then another. The places they knew best, marshes, river mouths, tidal flats, the zones where fish and wildfowl gathered, were often the first to go because flat land loses itself quietly. By around 8,000 years ago, Britain had become an island. By 7,500 years ago, Doggerland had been reduced to scattered low islands and shrinking ground. Then, around 8,200 years ago, the sea added violence to what had mostly been a slow disappearance. A submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, one of the largest underwater landslides in known geological history, displaced enough water to send a tsunami across what remained of the plain. Any communities still holding on in the lowlands would have had little warning and almost nowhere high enough to run. Whether that wave ended Doggerland's human story, or whether most of its people had already left, the archaeology cannot yet say cleanly. But the timing is difficult to ignore. The Storegga tsunami coincides closely with the final separation of Britain from continental Europe in the sediment record. The sea had been taking Doggerland for thousands of years. The tsunami may have been the last thing anyone remembered. Across the Atlantic, another lost world was narrowing. Beringia, the landmass connecting Siberia to Alaska, across what is now the Bering Strait, was the gateway through which the Americas were first peopled, probably beginning sometime between 20 and 15,000 years ago. But Beringia was not just a route. It was a place, a cold, wind-swept, biologically productive plain with its own rivers, animals, seasons, and human communities. Some people may have lived there for generations, not simply crossed it like a bridge. As sea levels rose, the southern margin flooded first, cutting the easiest passages between continents. The land narrowed decade by decade. By around 11,000 years ago, a broad corridor had become a shrinking peninsula. By 10,000 years ago, the strait had reopened, and Asia and North America were separated again for the first time in millennia. Anyone still living on the remaining land had to move east into Alaska or west into Siberia before the water made the decision for them. Then there is Sundaland. We touched it briefly earlier, but it deserves more space because its scale changes the question. If the richest human worlds at the end of the Ice Age were coastal, then Sundaland may be one of the largest missing chapters on Earth. At the glacial maximum, the Sunda Shelf, the continental platform beneath modern Southeast Asia, was largely exposed. The Indonesian archipelago, parts of the Philippines, the Malaysian peninsula, and the mainland were joined into a landmass roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent. Tropical, riverine, forested in the interior, and rich along the coast. Even during the Ice Age, this was not the brutal northern world of mammoth steppe and winter preparation. It was warm, wet, productive across the year, a place where human life could develop along a very different rhythm. Some researchers, Stephen Oppenheimer among them, with Graham Hancock building on that line of thought, have suggested that Sundaland may have supported some of the densest, most culturally developed human populations of the late Ice Age. That does not require us to imagine a lost empire. It asks us to take the geography seriously. If large numbers of people lived on those coasts, then the flooding of the Sunda Shelf between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years ago would have erased one of the largest inhabited landscapes in human history. Most of the evidence would now be underwater. The proof is not there yet. That matters. but the terrain has barely been surveyed, and that fact should change the tone of the objection. The flooding itself is not in doubt. The scale is not in doubt. What remains open is what kind of human world the water covered. The people living there did not vanish with the land. They moved. They crowded into higher ground, into island chains, into peninsulas and river valleys that remained above water. The genetic and linguistic diversity of modern Southeast Asia, the Philippines alone has more than 180 distinct languages, may preserve in altered form the fragmentation of communities that once belonged to a more connected landscape. The sea did not only destroy one world, it helped make many smaller ones. One more drowned landscape sits at the edge of the story of cities. The Persian Gulf, today a shallow sea between Arabia and Iran, was, during the glacial maximum, dry land, a fertile river valley fed by the combined drainage of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karen, and other rivers. Some researchers call it the Gulf Oasis. In a region otherwise pressed by aridity, it would have been an unusually well-watered lowland, with resources that the surrounding desert could not provide. As post-glacial seas rose, water began entering through the Strait of Hormuz. The basin filled over several thousand years and was largely flooded by around 8,000 years ago. Communities displaced from that valley would have moved north toward the Mesopotamian lowlands, exactly the region where, a few thousand years later, the first cities appeared. Maybe that is a coincidence, maybe it is not, but it is worth holding the possibility gently that some of the people who eventually built Ur and Uruk may have descended from communities pushed out of a flooded valley, carrying the memory of a richer lowland the sea had taken, building in the only direction left open to them. The problem with drowned worlds is not only that they disappeared, it is that they disappeared from the part of the world archaeology learned to read first. We are used to imagining the past beneath our feet, under fields, under cities, under desert sand, under the foundations of later worlds. Excavation feels like a downward motion. A trench opens, soil is removed, older human lives appear in layers, but some of the most important ground in human prehistory is no longer beneath anyone's feet. It is beneath the tide. That changes the kind of question we can ask. Archaeology has always had a geographical bias, partly because it has had a practical one. We study what can be reached. We excavate where we can stand. Dry land gives us grids, trenches, trowels, stratigraphy, careful hands moving through soil by centimetres. The land is difficult enough. It hides things, damages things, rearranges things, but at least it lets us breathe while we search. The sea does not offer that courtesy. Underwater, the archive becomes heavier, more expensive, more dangerous. Visibility can vanish in a cloud of disturbed sediment. Currents can move faster than a diver can work. Sand can cover a site for centuries, uncover it for a season, then cover it again. Wood may survive beautifully in low-oxygen mud, while bone dissolves somewhere else. A hearth may be protected under peat, while another, a few meters away, has been destroyed by waves, storms, trawling, anchors, or time. And before any of that, you have to know where to look. The continental shelves are enormous. They're not little strips of lost beach. They're drowned plains, river systems, estuaries, forests, marshes, hunting grounds, migration corridors, coastal camps, and perhaps whole cultural landscapes spread across millions of square kilometres. At the height of the last ice age, when sea level was hundreds of feet lower than today, these shelves were dry land, not marginal land, often very good land. Then the water returned, and with it, the evidence disappeared from sight. This is where absence becomes complicated. On land, when archaeologists say they have not found evidence for something, that absence may carry weight. People have walked the ground, surveyed it, dug into it, compared it with nearby sites. The silence has at least been listened to. Underwater, silence is different. A submerged valley may be called empty because no one has excavated it. A drowned shoreline may be called unknown because it lies under 10 meters of sediment. A coastal settlement may have existed exactly where the modern seabed has been churned for thousands of years, or it may be perfectly preserved in an anoxic pocket of mud that no one has sampled. The distinction between absent evidence and unsearched evidence becomes harder to hold. This does not mean we get to invent whatever we like. It means humility cuts in both directions. We should be careful with grand claims, with lost civilizations, sudden revelations, tidy stories in which everything missing becomes proof of exactly what we wanted to find. The sea has swallowed too many fantasies as well as too many facts. But we should be just as careful about pretending the dryland record is complete, because it is not. Ice Age people were not choosing their homes for the convenience of future archaeology. They were choosing them for food, water, shelter, movement, seasonality, and memory. And coastlines offered a combination of those things that few inland landscapes could match. A river mouth concentrates life. Fresh water meets salt water. Fish move through in seasonal pulses. Shellfish beds form in the shallows. Birds gather. Reeds grow. Mammals come to drink. Driftwood collects. Stone may be available upstream, marine food downstream, and terrestrial game moving along the edge between habitats. For a mobile human community, that edge is not empty space. It is abundance arranged in layers. Estuaries would have mattered. Tidal flats would have mattered. Sheltered bays, lagoons, offshore islands, reef systems, kelp forests, salmon runs, seal colonies, freshwater springs near the shore. All of these would have shaped where people returned, where they taught children to gather, where they buried the dead, where stories attached themselves to landmarks. The coast was not a line on a map. It was a way of living. And when the sea rose, it took precisely those places first. This is the intuition at the centre of Graham Hancock's strongest question, and it deserves to be taken seriously without being turned into a creed. You do not have to accept every reconstruction he proposes. You do not have to imagine a single lost mother civilization directing the ancient world from the shadows. You do not have to turn every myth into literal reportage or every underwater formation into architecture. But the basic question remains, if some of the richest Ice Age habitats were coastal, and if those coasts are now under the sea, then how much of the human story are we trying to reconstruct from the wrong half of the evidence? That is not a fringe question. It is a geographical one, and once you ask it, the map starts to look different. Doggerland, Sundaland, and the Persian Gulf oasis are not the same place, and they should not be made to carry the same story. One was a northern plain between Britain and Europe. One was a tropical shelf world in Southeast Asia. One was a low river basin at the edge of Mesopotamia. But together they show the same problem at three different scales. Productive human landscapes can vanish so completely that later history forgets to ask what happened there. This is especially important because different environments preserve different kinds of intelligence. A cold cave can keep paintings for 30,000 years. A dry shelter can keep stone tools in place. A high ridge can preserve a monument like Göbekli Tepe. But a tropical coastal world might leave a much lighter trace. Wood rots. Fibre disappears. Shell may survive, or it may be ground down by waves. Boats leave almost nothing. Nets vanish. A fishing technology made of plant fibre can disappear completely, while a stone point from a colder region survives long enough to define what sophistication looks like. This is one of the quiet distortions in prehistory. Stone is not the same thing as intelligence. Survival is not the same thing as preservation. A society that built with wood, wove nets, navigated by stars, harvested mangroves, managed coastal resources, moved by canoe, and carried its history through song might leave less behind than a much smaller group, napping flint beside a cave mouth. Not because it knew less, because the world did not keep its evidence in the same way. That does not mean every drowned shelf held cities. Most did not. The people living there may have been foragers, fishers, coastal navigators, seasonal gatherers, small communities with complex knowledge and light material traces. But complexity does not always announce itself with stone monuments. Sometimes it lives in roots, in calendars, in boat building, in ecological memory, in the ability to read a coast so precisely that survival depends on details no outsider would even notice. A tide pool can be a library if you know what it means. A reef can be a calendar. A migration route can be an inheritance. And when those things drown, the loss is not only material, it is cognitive. A way of knowing the world becomes detached from the place that made it possible. Sometimes, if conditions are right, the sea preserves what the land would have destroyed. Low-oxygen mud can protect wood, seeds, woven materials, even footprints. Peat deposits can preserve pollen from plants that grew when the seabed was dry. Sediment cores can bring up microscopic evidence of vanished forests. Spores, charcoal, insect remains, fragments of ancient DNA. Sonar can trace buried river channels beneath the seabed. Seismic data collected for oil and gas exploration can accidentally reveal the shape of lost landscapes in extraordinary detail. In that sense, the ocean is not only an eraser, it is also an archive. Not an archive with shelves and labels, an archive with currents. An archive that hides the page before letting you read it. To search it, archaeologists have to borrow the tools of other sciences: marine geology, remote sensing, bathymetry, sediment coring, paleoecology, ancient DNA. Sometimes the first clue is not a tool or a bone, but the shape of a buried channel, the chemistry of a mud layer, the pollen of a tree that could not have grown under salt water. A drowned landscape has to be reconstructed before the human site within it can even be guessed at. This is why the work is slow. You do not simply dive into the North Sea and find a village. You map the ancient river. You identify where the dry ground would have been. You look for peat, for old shorelines, for places sheltered from later erosion. You ask where fresh water met salt water 8,000 years ago. You ask where animals would have crossed. You ask where people would have waited for them. Then, if funding survives, if weather allows, if the sea gives you a few workable days, you take a core. A cylinder of mud comes up from the seabed. Inside it may be a forest floor, a marsh, a flood layer, a trace of charcoal, a change in pollen showing the arrival of open grassland or the retreat of trees. Nothing dramatic to the eye, just dark material in a tube. But that tube may contain a place where people once stood. There is something moving about that, not in a sentimental way, in a scale-changing way. The past becomes less like a museum and more like a drowned atmosphere, something surrounding us, under us, waiting in fragments. And the fragments are beginning to speak. The North Sea has given up animal bones, tools, worked antler, human remains, traces of old forests. Submerged landscapes around Britain have revealed Mesolithic activity in places that are now offshore. In parts of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Americas, archaeologists have identified ancient shorelines, drowned caves, submerged sites, and paleo landscapes that once belonged to terrestrial worlds. None of this gives us a hidden global civilization. It gives us something more interesting, and perhaps more useful: a correction. The old map of prehistory was drawn mostly from places that remained dry. The new one has to include places that did not. This may help explain why flood stories feel so different from ordinary disaster stories. A flood is rarely only about water. It is about the collapse of trust. The ground was supposed to be ground. The sea was supposed to stay where it belonged. The boundary was supposed to hold. When it fails, the world has broken a promise no one remembers making. Maybe that is why these stories last. Maybe not because one flood happened everywhere, or because every myth preserves a literal event, but because the end of the Ice Age produced the same kind of wound in many places. Coast after coast, shelf after shelf, river mouth after river mouth. People watching the familiar edge of the world move inland, then carrying that knowledge into new territories where the old landmarks could only survive as words. There was land there. The water came. We left. Do not forget. Over time, a practical warning can become sacred history. A memory of sea level rise can become a story of divine punishment, cosmic renewal, or a previous age swept away. The original shoreline vanishes, the moral remains. This is where Hancock's question returns, quieter but harder to dismiss. What if some myths are not failed science, and not pure invention, but damaged containers of environmental memory? What if a few of them preserve, in symbolic form, the trauma of real landscapes lost at the end of the Ice Age? We do not have to flatten myth into data to take that possibility seriously. Stories change. They borrow names, gods, heroes, meanings. They absorb politics, ritual, theology, fear. By the time they are written down, they may have travelled far from the event that first gave them force. But human memory is not as weak as modern people sometimes imagine. Oral cultures have preserved navigation routes, genealogies, ecological rules, volcanic eruptions, island formations, animal behaviour, and coastal changes across spans of time that once seemed impossible. Memory, when embedded in ceremony and repeated because survival depends on it, can become a durable technology. Not perfect, durable. And if that is true, then the seafloor and the mythic record may be two broken halves of the same archive. One preserves the place without the story. The other preserves the story without the place. We are only beginning to learn how to read them together. There is a temptation in subjects like this to rush toward revelation, to imagine that one day a sonar scan will reveal a lost city on the shelf, a temple older than Göbekli Tepe, a harbour from before the flood, some unmistakable object that forces the entire story of civilization to rearrange itself in a single afternoon. Maybe something like that will happen. Probably the truth will be slower. A scatter of sites, a worked timber here, a hearth there, a pollen core showing that a valley was habitable longer than expected, a submerged forest where no forest was supposed to be, a tool from a depth that changes the timeline of a coastline, a pattern that only becomes visible after decades of patient, unglamorous work. The past rarely returns as one clean answer. It returns as pressure, enough small findings accumulating until the old shape of the story can no longer hold them comfortably, and perhaps that is already happening. The dryland version of prehistory gave us a powerful story, Humans survived the ice, warmed into the Holocene, invented farming, built villages, then cities, then history. That story is not wrong, but it may be too dry, too much inland, too many caves and river valleys that happen to remain above water, too little attention to the coastlines where people may have lived for thousands of years before the sea covered their traces. If the underwater archive continues to open, the story may become less linear, less like a march from primitive to civilized, more like a series of experiments, many of them lost, coastal adaptations, seasonal networks, maritime knowledge, ritual places on ridges that became islands, then reefs, then nothing visible at all. Communities that had no writing and no cities, but knew their world in ways precise enough to survive until the world itself moved. That possibility changes the mood of the entire Ice Age ending. The melt was not only a background event making agriculture possible, it was also an eraser, a slow, planetary eraser passing over the places where human beings may have been most settled, most connected, most experimental, and most difficult for us to recover. Somewhere under the North Sea, old river channels still curve through the buried dark. Somewhere under the Sunda shelf, drowned valleys may hold the pollen of vanished forests and the trace of camps no one has found. Somewhere beneath the Persian Gulf, a landscape that may have fed human communities for millennia lies under warm shallow water, close to the later birthplace of cities, almost impossibly hard to study. The archive is there, not complete, not waiting obediently, not ready to confirm our favourite theories, but there. And the question it asks is simple enough to unsettle everything. How much of ourselves did the sea take? While the coastlines were drowning, another disappearance was unfolding on land. This one left fewer myths of flood, fewer stories of water crossing the boundary. It left emptier grasslands, forests growing into places once held open by enormous bodies, plants still defending themselves against mouths that no longer exist. The sea took the lowlands, but the warming world also began to lose its giants. Before the ice began retreating, North America held a living world that has no real equivalent today. The African savanna comes closest, but even that comparison undersells it. This was an entire ecological architecture, refined over millions of years, and within a few thousand years it would come apart. Woolly mammoths moved in herds across the northern grasslands. Their slightly smaller cousins, the mastodons, occupied the forested zones farther south. Giant ground sloths, some species reaching 20 feet when they reared upright, moved through the woodlands with the slow confidence of animals that had very little reason to hurry. Glyptodonts crossed the open plains armoured like small tanks, their clubbed tails capable of breaking bone. Short-faced bears, among the largest terrestrial mammalian predators ever to live, covered ground with a speed that must have looked wrong for an animal that size. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American horses and camels, both of which originated on this continent before some populations moved across Beringia into the Old World. A continent of giants, bound into an ecological web that had taken millions of years to weave. Between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, roughly 80% of North America's large mammal genera vanished. In South America, the losses were even more severe by some estimates. More than 80% of large mammal diversity gone from a continent that had evolved its own strange and beautiful fauna. Terror birds, toxodons, animals with no surviving relatives close enough to make them feel familiar. Australia had already lost its giants between 50 and 40,000 years ago, on a different timeline and with a different set of causes. But the pattern echoes. Again and again, When humans reached a landmass for the first time, large animals disappeared soon after. At some point, correlation stops feeling like a footnote. For decades, two explanations have carried most of the argument. Climate change, the disruption of ice age ecosystems as temperatures rose and vegetation zones shifted, and human hunting, the overkill hypothesis, which holds that hunters entering landscapes filled with animals that had no evolutionary memory of people killed them faster than they could replace themselves. The climate argument has real force. These animals were not simply large creatures that happened to tolerate cold. Many of them were built around very specific Ice Age worlds. The Mammoth Steppe, that vast grassland system stretching from Spain across Eurasia into Alaska, was shrinking as forest and tundra advanced. A mammoth was a grass-processing animal in body and behavior, teeth, gut, movement patterns, seasonal range, all shaped by a particular ecological machine. Change that machine quickly enough, and failure can begin long before it becomes visible. But mammoths had lived through earlier warm periods. So had many other large mammals. Previous interglacials had come and gone, and the giants had survived. Something about this transition was different. Uncomfortably, the difference seems to have been us. The overkill hypothesis, developed most forcefully by Paul Martin in the 1960s and refined since, argues that human hunters arriving in the Americas met animals that had not learned to fear a bipedal predator. African megafauna, elephants, rhinos, hippos, had millions of years to develop caution around humans and our ancestors. That wariness was selected for, generation after generation. American megafauna had no such history. Some species may have stood their ground as hunters approached, not because they were foolish, but because nothing in their world had taught them that a small upright animal at a distance could be fatal. The mathematics are quietly brutal. You do not need many hunters, and you do not need anyone intending extinction. You only need to push deaths a little above births. Large mammals reproduce slowly. An elephant carries a calf for 22 months. Mammoths were probably similar. In a stable world, slow reproduction is not a problem. Adults live long enough to compensate. But add a new predator that can kill adults consistently, and the arithmetic turns. Once a population enters sustained decline, extinction becomes a matter of time. The most careful reading of the evidence is not climate or hunting alone, but the two acting together. Climate change stressed the populations, broke habitats apart, reduced the grasslands and corridors they depended on. Human hunting added a pressure they had no instinctive defense against. Climate made recovery harder. Hunting may have made it impossible, and no one standing inside that process understood its scale. The last mammoths on mainland North America died while the builders of Göbekli Tepe were raising their first stones. A small relic population of woolly mammoths survived on Wrangel Island until around 1700 BCE, when the pyramids of Giza were already ancient. The hunters on the Mammoth Steppe were not calculating extinction rates. They were feeding families. They were following knowledge that had worked for generations. The idea that a species could be hunted out of existence, that there could be a last one, and that a human hand might be involved in its ending, was not yet available as a category of thought. We entered the first great extinction of the human era without knowing what an extinction was. That does not absolve us. It only makes the scene more human, and in some ways more sorrowful. There is a tree in North America called the honey locust. You may have passed one in a park without noticing it. They tolerate compacted soil and city air, so they turn up along streets and sidewalks, ordinary looking until you see the thorns. They're not delicate thorns. Honey locust can produce spikes up to 8 inches long, sometimes branched, sometimes clustered along the trunk and heavy limbs. They look excessive in the modern world because they are. They are not built for deer. They are not built for any animal now browsing North American trees. Their size and placement make more sense as a defense against something like a mammoth. A defense mechanism still running, still metabolically expensive, still shaping the body of the tree. The mammoth has been gone for 10,000 years, and the tree has not received the news. Biologists call these evolutionary anachronisms, traits calibrated to relationships that no longer exist. Plants and animals continuing to behave as if old partners might return. The Osage orange produces large, dense, heavily armoured fruits that very few living North American animals can use effectively. They are too big for modern deer and rodents to disperse well. Many researchers think they evolved around mastodons or giant ground sloths, animals capable of eating the fruit and carrying the seeds across distance. Now the fruits fall beneath the parent tree, rot, and move only a little. The strategy still exists. Its audience is gone. The Kentucky coffee tree produces tough pods filled with seeds, mildly toxic to much of today's wildlife. It likely evolved for an animal that could process them without much trouble. That animal is absent now. The tree keeps making the pods anyway, season after season, still speaking to a vanished ecology. The mammoths are gone, but parts of the world are still shaped around their absence. When you look at these plants together, the North American landscape begins to feel less settled than it appears. 10,000 years sounds ancient in human history. In evolutionary time, it is recent enough that many species have not yet adapted to the missing animals around which they evolved. The grasslands of the American Midwest do not differ from African savannas, only because of climate or soil. They are also missing the large herbivores that once held open spaces open, suppressed woody growth, broke branches, moved nutrients, carried seeds, and fertilized the ground as they crossed it. The landscape has been adjusting for 10,000 years, and it may not be finished. Africa shows the other side of the story. It kept elephants, rhinos, hippos, lions, wild dogs, much of its megafauna, probably because its animals had millions of years to adapt to human hunters. The arms race between human cleverness and animal caution unfolded slowly there. The prey learned, over deep time, to be appropriately afraid of us. The animals of the Americas, Australia and the islands did not have that time. We arrived too quickly to be incorporated into their instincts. There is something quietly sorrowful about the honey locust thorns, a defense against a ghost, a living structure that has outlasted its purpose by 100 centuries, still appearing in new growth, still warning an animal that will never come close again. Meaning does not always survive with the form. The consequences of megafauna loss moved outward through entire ecosystems. Large herbivores are not just animals inside a landscape, they are engineers of it. Their grazing, browsing, trampling, dung, migrations and disturbances create conditions that other species depend on. Remove them, and the structure changes. Fire regimes shift as woody vegetation increases and fuel loads build. Nutrient cycling changes, seed dispersal changes, even soil chemistry and microbial life change, because the dung of large animals was once part of the system at scale. Some of those changes, compounded across 10,000 years, have pushed North American ecosystems into patterns they may not easily leave. Shrub encroachment into grasslands, altered fire frequency. Plant species are absent from areas they might otherwise occupy, because the animals that carried them are gone. The world we inherited from the Ice Age is not simply the world after the ice, It is the world after the giants. We have lived inside the consequences of those first extinctions for the whole span of civilization, usually without noticing the shape of the absence. Imagine you have been a mammoth hunter your entire life. Your father was one, your grandfather was one. The knowledge of how to find them, how to read their tracks over seasonal ground, how to approach from downwind, how to coordinate a hunt across a wide landscape. All of that is inheritance, not only skill, identity, the framework through which your family understands its place in the world. And then the mammoths are gone, not everywhere at once, not suddenly, but the herds thin. The migration routes your grandfather knew are empty. The watering places where animals could always be found have been quiet for 2 seasons. Something is ending, and you can feel it before you have a story that explains it. Human communities across the Americas, Europe and Asia faced some version of this problem as the megafauna declined. What followed was not one human response, but many. Different communities made different bets, each shaped by local weather, plants, animals, rivers, coastlines, and memory. Some changed their hunting. The atlatl appears in several regions during this broad period, perhaps as part of a shift toward animals that were faster, more alert, and harder to approach than the giants. The bow and arrow, emerging somewhat later in many places, pushed that further. Quieter, quicker to reload, accurate at distances that made sense for prey that would not stand still. Smaller animals required a different technical vocabulary. People learned it. Others turned toward water. Coastal and riverine communities developed increasingly sophisticated fishing technologies during the early post-glacial world. Fixed weirs and traps to intercept salmon runs, nets woven to particular mesh sizes, hooks shaped differently for open water fish and bottom feeders, boats capable of offshore fishing, which meant not only construction skill but a whole knowledge of tides, currents, seabirds, weather and the colour of the sea. These were not panicked improvisations, they were technical traditions, built slowly enough to be inherited. The shell middens that appear along coastlines around the world are the visible remains of that shift. Some reach depths of 30 feet or more, built by communities returning to the same places season after season for thousands of years. Layer by layer they record changes in a coastline's life, which shellfish were abundant when certain fish entered the catch, when marine mammal hunting began. They look like heaps of refuse until you learn to read them. Then they become archives. But the adaptation that changed everything happened in the Levant, the region of modern Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria and the Palestinian territories. And it did not look like a revolution while it was happening. It looked like people staying put. The Natufians were doing something unusual, living in permanent or semi-permanent settlements while still relying primarily on wild resources. Their villages, stone-founded, substantial, sometimes large enough for hundreds of people, appear in the archaeological record around 12,500 years ago, near the end of the Younger Dryas. They were not farmers yet, but they were no longer moving in the old way. That single change brought consequences no one could have seen from inside it. They could stay because parts of the Levant held wild cereal stands dense enough to support regular harvesting. Einkorn wheat, emmer, wild barley, growing in concentrations that could feed communities through storage. In a few intense weeks, a group could gather enough grain to support a settlement for months. Add wild game, fish, nuts, fruits, and the diverse resources of Mediterranean woodland, and the arithmetic worked. Movement became optional, then less attractive, then difficult to abandon. But staying in one place changes the pressure on everything nearby. A mobile community spreads its needs across a landscape. A settled community returns to the same cereal stands year after year. The Natufians began, probably without naming it as management, to alter those stands, clearing competing plants, scattering seeds in useful places, favouring patches that were easier to harvest, noticing which plants held their grain better. Here, something subtle happened. Wild cereals scatter their seeds through brittle rachises. The joints connecting seed to stem break at maturity, flinging seed onto the ground. For the plant, this is excellent. For a human harvester, it is frustrating. Arrive a little late, and half the food has already fallen. But occasionally a plant carries a variant that keeps the rachis tough, so the seeds stay on the stalk. In the wild, that plant is at a disadvantage because its seeds do not disperse well. In a human-harvested stand, it is exactly the plant whose seeds are gathered, stored, and eventually sown again. No theory of genetics was needed. No one had to decide to invent wheat. The grain was changing under human hands. Similar processes unfolded elsewhere, each with local plants and local pressures. Rice and millet in China, maize in Mesoamerica, transformed over millennia from a small wild grass into one of the great crops of the world. Potatoes in the Andes, taro in New Guinea, sorghum in sub-Saharan Africa. These were not copies of one original idea. They were separate answers to a similar condition. Stable enough climate, growing populations, familiar plants, and communities spending enough time in one place for cultivation to begin feeding back into biology. Agriculture then was less a sudden invention than a relationship that tightened. People harvested plants. Plants changed under harvesting. The changed plants rewarded staying. Staying increased dependence. Dependence made the next season's crop more important than the last. The Ice Age ended, the climate steadied, and the first farmers emerged through a chain of ordinary decisions. We should be careful, though, about calling this simply progress. Farming supported population densities that foraging could not. It made villages larger, storage more important, eventually cities and writing and specialization possible. But it also narrowed life in ways the bones remember. A foraging community moves with the seasons, distributing risk across a landscape. A farming community stays and bets heavily on harvest. When the harvest fails, drought, flood, frost, blight, the fallback is smaller than it once was. The wild resources a mobile group might have used in lean years have often been crowded out, claimed, or over-harvested by the settlement itself. The grain in the pit becomes security. It also becomes a trap. With storage came new social tensions. Someone had to manage the pit. Someone had to settle disputes over fields. Someone had to organize planting, harvesting, irrigation, defense. The enforced sharing and suspicion of hoarding that characterize many foraging societies are harder to maintain when food can be accumulated and guarded. Agriculture did not invent hierarchy. It created conditions in which hierarchy could take root and stay. The skeletal evidence from early farming communities is complicated and sobering. The first farmers were often shorter than their foraging predecessors. Their teeth show more cavities. Their bones show more signs of nutritional stress and repetitive strain. A grain-heavy diet could feed more people while making individual bodies less robust. By some measures, the shift to agriculture was a biological step backward. And still, farming populations grew. Fast. A farming community, even a less healthy one, could support more children per woman because the caloric floor was higher and birth spacing could narrow. More children meant more land cleared, more grain planted, more storage built, more labour organised. The system compounded. Once it began, it became difficult to reverse. Foraging communities that did not adopt agriculture were gradually squeezed, sometimes violently, often demographically. More farmers meant more land under cultivation. More cultivated land meant less room for wild foods and seasonal movement. The old way of living needed space, and space was being absorbed. The first farmers were not visionaries trying to create civilization. They were people responding to pressure. Fewer giants, changed habitats, stable seasons, growing settlements, reliable plants, hungry children, remembered scarcity. They made reasonable decisions close to the ground. The long consequences arrived later. That may be one of the most human patterns in the whole story. We rarely enter the future by understanding it. More often, we arrive there by solving the problem directly in front of us. 11,700 years ago, something steadied. Not with a dramatic event, not with a boundary that anyone living through it could have pointed to and said, "Here, this is where the new world begins." The change was quieter than that. A gradual settling of climate, then a sustained one, until the planet entered one of the more unusual intervals in the past several 100,000 years, the Holocene, our epoch, the one we are still living inside. Its strangeness was not simply warmth. Earth had been warm before, during earlier interglacials. The strange thing was the steadiness, the violent swings of the preceding millennia, sudden warming, abrupt cooling, the Younger Dryas, the repeated trouble in the ocean currents, began to quiet. Seasons grew more dependable. Monsoons arrived with something closer to rhythm. The difference between a good year and a bad year narrowed into a range people could plan around, rather than merely survive. You can be clever in an unstable climate. You can be resourceful, technically brilliant even. The people of the last glacial maximum were all of those things. They knew how to live in a world most of us would find almost impossible. What instability makes difficult is patience on the scale of a field. Agriculture asks you to trust the future. You clear ground, you plant seeds, you tend a crop through a season and wait for a return that will not come for months. All of that rests on a quiet assumption that there will be a growing season, that the rains will come within some recognizable range, that midsummer will not suddenly become something else. For much of the previous 100,000 years, that confidence was fragile. The safest answer was movement. Follow the animals, follow the plants, follow whatever is working now, because next year may not resemble this one. The Holocene changed that calculation. Staying became, for the first time in a very long time, a reasonable gamble. A storage pit could matter next year. A house could be worth repairing. A field could be worth returning to. And people, carrying thousands of years of knowledge about plants, animals, seasons, soils, and water, began to invest that knowledge in place. Within 5,000 years of the Holocene's beginning, farming communities had appeared independently in several parts of the world. These were not all copies of a single invention spreading outward. The crops were different, the animals were different, the ecological settings were different. What repeated was the underlying logic. In a steadier world, cultivation could stop being a risky experiment and become a strategy that survived across generations. The Holocene did not invent agriculture. People had been watching, tending, selecting, and experimenting with plants long before then. What the new climate offered was continuity. Enough continuity for an experiment to become a way of life. Population growth followed with a force that is startling even in retrospect. At the end of the Ice Age, there may have been 5 to 10 million humans on Earth. By 5,000 years ago, estimates range from 40 to 100 million. More reliable food supported more people. More people meant more labour. More labour made larger harvests possible. For the first time in human history, the feedback loop kept pulling in the direction of growth. The physical world was changing around them too. As the ice retreated, forests moved north across the hemisphere with astonishing speed. Birch and pine came first, colonizing the raw ground the glaciers had left behind. Then oak, elm, maple and beech spread out from their southern refuges, filling in the temperate forests we now take for granted. The tropics expanded. The Amazon, which had been fragmented into isolated forest patches during the coldest and driest phases of the Ice Age, reconnected into a vast continuous system. The Congo Basin followed a similar path. Rainfall increased, temperatures steadied. The green parts of the world widened again. The world was beginning to look familiar. Coastlines were still moving. The ice sheets had not finished melting, and the ocean was still climbing. But the great pulses of rapid inundation were behind them. Sea level rise slowed toward the shorelines we recognize today, many of which were largely established by around 7,000 years ago. After millennia of retreat, coastal communities finally had ground that did not vanish quite so quickly beneath them. That steadiness can feel inevitable from inside it. It is easy, living in a stable interval, to mistake stability for the personality of the planet. But the Holocene was never a promise. It was a condition, a particular alignment of orbit, ice, atmosphere, ocean circulation, and chemistry that produced a long calm. The ice cores do not show a planet that prefers stillness. They show a planet that changes, sometimes violently, and occasionally grants a pause long enough for forests, fields, villages, and cities to gather themselves. Civilization grew inside that pause. One more transformation still had to unfold, not in the north, where the ice had been, and not in the river valleys we usually imagine when we think about early civilization, but in a landscape that now seems almost designed to refuse life. The Sahara Desert covers roughly 9 million square kilometers. It stretches from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania to the Red Sea coast of Sudan, from the Mediterranean shore of Libya down to the edge of the Sahel. It is larger than the continental United States. On a modern map it looks absolute: heat, sand, stone, distance. A landscape that seems to say, with unusual clarity, that it is not interested in supporting human life. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, that same region was almost unrecognizable. During what geologists call the African humid period, the Green Sahara, changes in Earth's orbit strengthened and shifted the West African monsoon northward. Rain reached deep into the interior of the continent. Grasslands spread across what are now sand seas. Acacias and palms grew in valleys that today hold little more than stone and wind. Rivers ran where there is now no permanent surface water for hundreds of miles. The lakes are among the most vivid evidence. Lake Chad today is a shrunken remnant, shallow and heavily silted. At its mid-Holocene peak, it was something closer to an inland sea. Mega Lake Chad was larger than the modern Caspian Sea. Its old shorelines are still visible in the surrounding landscape, cut into rock by waves from a body of water that has not existed for 5,000 years. The same pattern repeats across the Sahara: empty lake basins, dry river channels still visible from above, fossil shorelines, a ghost hydrology, the map of a wet world drawn underneath the desert that replaced it. Hippos wallowed in Saharan lakes. Crocodiles basked on riverbanks in what is now the central Libyan desert. Elephants, giraffes, and antelope moved through grasslands that stretched from the Atlantic toward the Nile. The rock art of the Sahara, painted and engraved across thousands of sites, shows this world plainly. Swimming animals, cattle herds, hunters, dancers, people gathered near water. That is what makes the images so moving. They are not fantasies of abundance. They are scenes of ordinary life in a landscape that has become almost impossible to picture. The people living there were not passing through. They were residents. Pastoral communities herding cattle across the Saharan grasslands appear in the archaeological and genetic record from around 9,000 years ago. During this period, the Sahara was not a barrier between the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa. It was a corridor, cattle herding practices, tools, symbolic traditions, and people moved across it through a world of grass and water. Then, around 5,000 to 500 years ago, the rains began to fail. The monsoon shifted south again. In some regions, the transition from Green Sahara to something like the modern desert unfolded over only a few centuries, quickly enough for communities to experience the change within family memory. Once vegetation died back, the exposed land reflected more sunlight, which reduced local rainfall further, which killed more vegetation. The desert began to reinforce itself. Imagine a pastoralist in the central Sahara around 5,500 years ago. Your grandparents knew the rains as reliable. Your parents remember lakes that filled each season. In your own lifetime, the grass has pulled back from grazing lands your community has used for generations. The animals are already moving, following the retreating vegetation south and east, the way animals do. You do not have a theory of orbital forcing. You have thirst, you have dust, you have the direction your herds are walking. Many Saharan communities moved toward the Nile Valley. The Nile remained one of the few reliable water systems in the region, fed by rainfall far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, beyond the failing monsoon of North Africa. Its annual floods laid down rich alluvial silt with a regularity that must have seemed almost miraculous beside the drying desert. But reliable land surrounded by desert is also limited land. As more people concentrated along the Nile, abundance came with pressure. Fields had edges, water had timing, storage had to be managed, conflicts had to be settled. The same river that made life possible also forced people into closer, more organized arrangements. Within a few centuries of Saharan desertification, the archaeological record along the Nile shows population density rising, social stratification increasing, monumental construction beginning, and eventually, around 5,000 years ago, the emergence of pharaonic Egypt. The chain is not simple enough to turn into a single cause. Climate does not build temples by itself. People do, but climate can gather people into places where temples become thinkable. It can remove one world and concentrate the survivors along the edge of another. The Sahara made pastoral worlds. Then it dried, and the people shaped by that vanished landscape helped build something that lasted for thousands of years. Around 5,500 years ago, in the river valleys of southern Mesopotamia, the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, something appeared that had never existed before anywhere on Earth. A city. Uruk, Eridu, Ur. The names carry a strange weight because they are among the oldest urban names we have. These were places where tens of thousands of people lived close together, supported by agricultural surplus from the countryside around them. Places with specialized labor, monumental buildings, administrative systems, and strangers. That last part matters. A city is one of the first human environments where most people do not know most other people. Anonymity becomes possible. So does bureaucracy. How did this happen? In one sense, agriculture worked too well. Once reliable farming took hold in the Fertile Crescent, population growth followed in ways that were probably invisible from inside the process. Each generation was a little larger. Villages that had held dozens came to hold hundreds. Fields spread outward. Storage became more important. Settlements crossed a threshold where the old methods of face-to-face negotiation could no longer carry the whole weight of the community. Someone had to keep track of the grain, not because anyone set out to invent authority, because without some form of management, stores would be used unevenly, obligations would be forgotten, disputes would accumulate, and the surplus that made the settlement possible would disappear into friction. The first administrators may not have been seeking power in any grand sense. They were solving a practical problem that had grown too large for memory and custom alone. Irrigation made the problem sharper. The Mesopotamian floodplain was fertile, but water did not distribute itself politely. The most productive land depended on canals that required collective labour to build and maintain. A farmer who took more than his share harmed the fields downstream. Someone had to judge the claim. Someone had to enforce the answer. Someone had to organise repairs before the next season. These are not problems an isolated household can solve for long. Institutions began there, in the gap between what people needed and what informal life could manage. Writing emerged from the same pressure. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia are not poems or histories, they are accounts. Grain delivered, livestock counted, labour owed, clay tablets holding yesterday still enough for someone tomorrow to inspect it. Writing began, in part, as an external memory for a society too large for any one human mind to hold. From that same pressure came temples, palaces, armies, and law. Each solved a problem created by scale, and each created new problems in turn. Temples concentrated surplus and redistributed it through ritual. Palaces organized labor for canals, walls, and monuments. Armies protected stored wealth from those who had not produced it but could take it. The machinery of civilization did not arrive all at once. It assembled itself piece by piece around the management of food, water, labor, and time. None of this required a master plan. No one stood outside history and designed the city. Cities grew the way living systems grow, through local decisions repeated under pressure, until a larger pattern appeared that no single person had intended. More grain supported more people. More people required more coordination. Coordination required records. Records made larger projects possible. Larger projects made the city more necessary. Every market, every courthouse, every university, every apartment window lit after midnight, every piece of music composed in a room rather than under open sky. All of it traces, however, indirectly through this sequence, not to progress in some clean moral sense, but to a long period of climate stability that made staying put profitable enough to change the human condition. The Holocene was the background condition. The city was one of its consequences, but cities also changed the terms of human life. In a mobile foraging world, accumulation is limited by what can be carried, and hierarchy is limited by the possibility of leaving. If the herd moves, you move. If a leader becomes unbearable, the group can fracture. When grain is stored in pits, when fields require seasons of labour, when walls surround the place where your investment sits, leaving becomes more expensive. The administrator who once solved a logistics problem now stands near the stores. From there, power is not far away. The skeletal record from the transition to farming tells a complicated story. Early farmers were, on average, shorter than many of their foraging predecessors. Their teeth show more cavities. Their bones show signs of nutritional stress and repetitive labour. Grain could feed more people, but often with less dietary variety. Settlement brought security of one kind and new vulnerabilities of another. And still the populations grew. They grew quickly, and they kept growing, in ways foraging populations generally did not. Agriculture narrowed certain aspects of individual life while expanding the human presence on the planet. Once that logic began compounding, it became very difficult to reverse. Civilization was not simply humanity getting better at living. It was humanity learning to live in one place, under pressure, in large numbers, and then discovering that the solutions to that problem would become the structure of history. Somewhere in Scandinavia the ground is still rising. The ice that pressed it down has been gone for 10,000 years, and the land is still returning slowly to where it was. It will keep rising for thousands of years more. The crust of the earth has a long memory. So, in our own stranger way, do we. The end of the Ice Age did not leave one kind of evidence behind. It left afterlives, a shoreline underwater, a tree with thorns for an animal that no longer exists, a grain field descended from wild grasses once harvested by hand, a city still organized around storage, water, walls, records, and debt, a desert full of rock paintings from a time when hippos lived where sand now moves. None of it was designed. The orbital changes that helped end the Ice Age were not aimed at us. The hunters who pursued mammoths were not trying to empty the world of giants. The Saharan herders who followed their cattle toward the Nile were not planning Egypt. The first scribes pressing marks into clay were not imagining libraries, scripture, archives, novels, or history. They were trying to count grain. Again and again, this story returns to the same unsettling pattern. People solving the problem in front of them, while the meaning of what they are doing only becomes visible much later. A family moves inland because the old camp is too close to the water now. A hunter changes prey because the herds are thinner. A community stores more grain because the village has grown. A pastoralist walks east with thirsty animals. A builder raises a stone on a ridge and seals something inside a circle of pillars. The decision is local. The consequence is historical. That may be the most human part of the whole transition. We rarely enter the future by recognizing it. More often we arrive there by adapting to whatever has just become difficult. The world after the ice was full of difficulty. Melting, flooding, cold returning, warmth returning, animals disappearing, forests advancing, grasslands failing, coastlines moving farther inland than memory wanted to allow. And through all of it, human beings kept doing what human beings do. Remembering, adjusting, carrying, misremembering, rebuilding, telling the story again in a form that could survive the next loss. This is why the missing parts of prehistory matter so much. Not because every absence hides a monument, not because the sea is waiting to confirm every beautiful theory we bring to it, but because a human world does not have to leave pyramids behind in order to have been rich, organized, skilled, or meaningful. A coastline can hold knowledge. A reef can hold a calendar. A route between islands can be an inheritance. A seasonal gathering place can shape lives for thousands of years and then vanish beneath sediment with almost no trace above the modern map. Dry land has given us an extraordinary record. Caves, bones, hearths, tools, seeds, temples, walls. But it is not the whole record. Some of the old human world survived where we could dig. Some of it survived in stories. Some of it survived in plants and landscapes that still behave as if missing animals might return. And some of it, perhaps a great deal of it, passed below the waterline before anyone could write down what had been there. That does not make the past unknowable. It makes it humbling. Göbekli Tepe is part of that humility. A ridge in southeastern Turkey held onto something that the old model did not expect. Foragers organising labour, stone, animals, sky, and ritual on a scale that once seemed impossible before farming. It survived because it was high enough, dry enough, and finally because someone looked closely enough. It does not prove a lost civilization. It proves that our map of human possibility was too small, and if one dry hill could change the question, then the drowned edges of the world deserve patience too. The Holocene gave us a long calm, not a guarantee, not an ending, a window. Inside it we built fields, villages, gods, calendars, walls, ships, laws, songs, machines, and all the fragile arrangements we now mistake for permanence. But we are not the first people to live through a familiar world becoming unfamiliar. We are not the first to discover that coastlines move, climates turn, animals vanish, and memory has to carry what the ground no longer can. Wherever you're listening from tonight, there is another landscape underneath the one you know, an older shoreline, a buried river, a vanished forest, a desert that was once green, a plain beneath the sea, a world before the map you inherited. The ice is gone. The world it made is the one you are in, and not all of its memory is behind us. Some of it is under the streets, in the fields, in the stories, in the thorns of trees, and in the dark water beyond the shore. Good night.